Hi everyone, this is Tim. Welcome to North and South Podcasts. This is a history podcast with my father, who was on the first proper episode of North and South nearly 2 years ago. And I've been meaning to get him back on to talk about his interests in Russian and Soviet Union, USSR history. Since the Cold War finished, a lot of young people today don't know too much about the Soviet Union and USSR, etc. But my dad's always had an interest in Russia and the Soviet Union. He's actually been to Russia and the Soviet Union 4 times, including well before the end of the Cold War, or a few years before the end.
When Gorbachev came in, yeah.
Yeah, so we'll have a chat about that. Also, Dad, thanks. I've got a bit of an interest in history that comes from you. I became a history teacher after you become a history teacher. And my interest in these topics comes from you as well. So it's something that the family are interested in. So, first of all, you went to the Soviet Union, as it was, in 1986 for the first time. But had you had an interest in that before then? Because it's interesting to find out where that came from. Because when I was growing up during the Cold War, there was still that threat of nuclear war in the 80s, but it thawed a little bit with Reagan and Gorbachev, etc., and the meetings in Iceland between the two sides. But what got you interested in that topic? Because it was something that people in the West didn't always acknowledge. Apart from making out that the Soviet Union was a bad place, you know, this communist empire or whatever, that you kind of got through the media here, particularly with the war in Afghanistan, that covered the final years of the Soviet Union and hastened its demise, as it were. What got you interested in it?
Well, I think at first was like things like the World at War. I was only a kid, so I'm going back. I was almost probably 8 and 9, something. And my brothers, they were much older, used to watch this I think it was Thursday night. And you always remember the narrator, the famous actor, the voice. And most
Laurence Olivier, wasn't it? It's a classic series.
That's right. It was every theatre of war, you know. It was like the Battle of the Bulge and, you know, the Pacific and stuff. But I always found the most thought-provoking and resonant was the Eastern Front. And it was just something that appealed to me. It just seemed so stark, so vivid. And it was things like the cold. I always remember the scene of the siege of Leningrad, a little old man sitting in a library, and there's a metronome, just tick, tock, and a little old guy with freezing cold, with fingerless gloves, and he's eating what I thought looked like a brick, but apparently it was his bread ration. And it just showed the stoicism of what it was about, and, you know, the sacrifice that these people were making for whatever it was, this ideal, you know, the Soviet thing. And then, other than that, you know, the battles on the Eastern Front, when he showed you the numbers as a theatre, it was so much bigger than what was going on elsewhere. It was, and with the Nazis and the Soviets, I mean, it was the ultimate, you know, clash of ideologies. I wasn't, as a kid, I wasn't into that, but it just seemed to me there was something about it. And then there was the Churchillian thing, you know, what was it, enigma, mystery and all that. And it's always been a bogeyman. And I just thought, immature as a kid, well, if this is such a bogeyman, how do these people fight so much for it, you know what I mean? Mm. What are they fighting for? Because no one had ever explained that, other than they were like Russians, the Russian Empire, the fight there, you know. It's not an ideological thing as such. It's more a cultural thing. But I just thought there'd be more to it. And then I remember the satellites came in. There was a Telstar, the first communications. And they showed the first few of the, you know, the May Day parades. Like, they'd be on about 8 o'clock in the morning. And Dimbleby, you know, Bumblebee, like the voice, talking over, and all these big tanks rolling through Red Square. It was all the thing about, you know, World War II and the Great Patriotic War. And it just triggered something in me to think, well, you know, what is this all about? I just wanted to know more myself. I was just intrigued by it as a kid, you know. Yeah.
To what extent did that fit into the political sphere as well? Because although the Labour Party was considered a socialist party, and in many ways still is, and in many ways the Conservative Party in the UK has accepted a lot of what may be called socialist things like the NHS and the education system, as much as they might be willing to undermine it. Socialism is part and parcel of the British fabric now, even though people don't really like to say it. But to what extent did you find something in the Soviet Union that preached something different to what was going on in the West? Because many people point to the darker side of the Soviet Union, etc. But to what extent were you interested in the political side of things? And
well, that's the point. Because if you were interested in anything Soviet or political, they called it agitprop. It was propaganda, right? You're falling for propaganda. You're just a useful idiot. That's what they want you to do. And I said, well, hang on. Well, where do we find the truth? What actually does go on there? What are the ideals behind it? That kind of thing. And that's what I found, confusing, because when I was a young guy, every time you went to movies, sorry, I'm thinking like Ice Station Zebra and stuff like that, everything was basically anti-Soviet. A Man from U.N.C.L., Smash, everything you watch, all popular culture was basically anti-Soviet. And then if you said, well, hang on, what is going on? Oh, you're a useful idiot. You're falling for propaganda. And it was like a bit of a conundrum. You're thinking, well, here a minute. So, you've got where would you get a pro-Soviet point of view? Yeah. Right? And that was a difficult thing. And then the actual social aspect of it, of, land, housing, jobs, medical, the whole social fabric of, we never got told anything really about that. It was just taboo. It was always stark and dark and violent and threatening. I mean, there was a wonderful advert once for, I think it was Levi Jeans, where he just showed this lad. It came up and it was like somewhere in the Eastern Bloc, or he made it look good. They had like an old Soviet-type bus, and he gets off a plane and everything is grey and miserable. It's a little bit like Schindler's List, the little girl in the red coat. It was very much like that. And then this lad goes there and the officer opens his case and looks at him. There's a bit of sweat on his brow. Then he gets on this crowded bus, goes up these grotty stairs to his grotty apartment in this grotty place in, some Soviet goddamn city somewhere. And then when he gets in, he closes the door behind him, big sigh of relief. He puts the case on the bed, opens it up and pulls out, it's a pair of Levi jeans and the little tab, the Levi tab. That's red. So, what was the significance of that? You know what I mean? That out of all this doom and gloom, this guy's actually smuggled back, a little bit of Western lightness and advancement. It was quite stark. It was brilliant, yeah.
I do remember all that, and I think that during the Cold War, I think in the West, obviously the media and the governments were given a particular angle to things. And I think that there's a lot of achievements about communism and the Soviet Union, which you don't always hear about, like women's education, healthcare, etc. We also know about the endemic corruption and the abuse of power that goes along with what might be called dictatorship. Yeah. And there's a lot of criticisms of human nature, etc., when you allow certain people too much power. And all of these debates, and I remember reading a book about the Cold War, and it was huge chapters on like Czechoslovakia and Hungary in 56 and 68, when many people in the West started to realise that the Soviet Union was ultimately a power bloc that was looking to preserve itself, and there were some disadvantages to it. But at the same time, you didn't always hear about the Contras in Central America and the much bigger numbers of people killed by the Contras with like US support. So you had all these contradictions going on. I think that the historical record of the Soviet Union in terms of, I think particularly under Stalin, with the purges, etc., and then normal people get caught up in all the paranoia, etc. But at the same time, there's a lot of reasons why the Soviet Union had that kind of culture, because it had been under threat of invasion and destruction. And I mean, that's a different aspect, the historical record on communism in the Soviet Union and also China, which we'll come to shortly. Now, you first went to Leningrad, was it in 86?
86,
tell us about that. Yeah. And that's called St. Petersburg today, built by Peter the Great in the early 1700s. And it was renamed Leningrad after Lenin after the revolution. So what was it like the first time you went there?
Well, the first time it was Soviet, and of course the cradle of the revolution and all that. we were accompanied most places we went. Saying that, we weren't totally chaperoned. There was a guy, an Australian guy. He was a lot older than me, but he was a sort of public transport buff. And through him, actually, before I was in Moscow with him, I didn't get on with him at first because we shared a room, actually. And he was a little bit difficult, and I just told him what I thought, and, you know, he went quiet for a bit. And then one afternoon he said to me, they'd all gone off to some ballet thing or something. And he said, are you going out? I said, yeah. And he said, where are you going? I said, I'll just walk around the Prospect Mira, get the district where the hotel was in Moscow. And he said, do you want to go on the metro? I said, yeah. I said, but it's a bit He said, no. He said, we're all right, we'll do it together. So we went out with him, with David. His name was, I think it was David Morgan from Newcastle, New South Wales. And he went on we got it, we blagged it, because it wasn't colour-coded then, the metro. And we were lucky where economic achievements was. The station was KVH. I think they call it Kiev in Moscow, Kiev. So there's an abbreviation for it. Because all the others, the Cyrillic alphabet, but it wasn't colour-coded. It was like really tricky. And so I don't think I would have done it on my own. I would have bottled. But David said, oh, come on. I mean, he was like, I was, 38, he was 60-odd. And so we went round on the metro, and we went down to Revolution Square, went to Red Square. We just went round everywhere on this metro. He could speak a bit of German, and the Russians would speak him in German, but they wouldn't really speak to us. You wouldn't get into open conversation. Right, but then when we went up to Leningrad, because I was with David, we did the same with the Leningrad metro.
So where were you initially with David?
He went on the tour with me all round. He went everywhere with me.
But sorry, were you just in Leningrad first visit?
No, the Moscow, and then we went to Leningrad.
Right.
But it was in Moscow that I realised he took us out on the system. He just wanted to do it. And on the trams and everything, he was amazing. And so he gave me that bottle to think, oh, hang on, you know. And this was in the Soviet Union, like 86. We would go on tours, like they took us to the Kremlin and Lenin's library and stuff like that. But we did get out ourselves, right? And it was terrific. But we noticed people didn't really want to mingle with us. Yeah. There was no phone book or nothing, you know. It was funny, you had these phone kiosks with no phone book. Nothing was colour-coded. The metros are so deep, it's actually a military thing, you know what I mean? There's shelters for the people and all that. And it was quite a stark contrast. But then when you go to Leningrad, it was the cradle of the revolution. Everything was the 900-day siege. We went to Lenin's places, you know, where he frequented. You know, the ballerina's house and all that. And a lot of it, like, the total thing was Bolsheviks and everything. And then we ended up, I think it was called Peshkoye, the cemetery, where a lot of the dead of Leningrad are buried, the poor people who were left on the streets and stuff like that, you know. And, of course, one of them even mentioned about cannibalism stuff during the 900-day siege. But funny enough, the woman pointed out, if you listen to the music, eternal music that they play, she said, it's actually Brahms. She said, it's quite interesting, actually, isn't it, that they have a German composer, you know, with this music and the sort of, for the victims of the siege. And everything was overtly political, everything. It was like, basically, it was the cradle of the revolution, and everything was to do with, you know, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin and everything else. And it was fascinating. It really was.
What was your general impression of the place? Obviously, you're in two places which are not very typical of wider Russia, if you think of the size of Russia.
Oh, no.
So you've got like a western-facing city with Western architecture built by Peter the Great. Moscow, the older capital. You had a bit of chaperoning, but you got out there in the state, well, within those two cities, etc. What was your general impression of daily life? Because Gorbachev was already the leader. He was the big reformer.
Yeah, they were talking about perestroika and stuff like that then, right as soon as he got in. But it was, I would say, bleak. We were in a bus. There was 19 of us. And funny enough, the tour was tour 19. And we were in this bus, and there was like most of the seats were empty. It was in tourists, they just took us round. And you would look, there was cars on the streets, you know, Moscoviches and Larders and stuff like that. But, and some of the streets were like tree-lined and whatever. And Valentina, the woman who escorted us, she would talk about this beautiful inner ring road or this beautiful avenue. And it was April, actually. It was quite stark, and there was still snow on the ground. It was cold, and it wasn't beautiful, you know what I mean? But you say, I can imagine in the summer it is. But they had this thing. They'd use these, cliches, adjectives are beautiful and this, that, and the other. But really, there was very little interaction with the people. There was no adverts at all. Every night when the lights, it looked dull and dark. It was depressing, to be honest, The city centre, Red Square and stuff was impressive and that. But the overall impression, because there's a linguistic problem, cultural problem, couldn't really, So people in the hotels, they speak local, and they would keep the distance from you, It'd be just business and there'd be no sort of small talk. But it did look a bit bleak. And Leningrad the same. When we travelled around Leningrad, went to the island, Vasily Island and places, it was the weather in Leningrad. There was a wind off the Baltic. And it was moist. It was different climate to Moscow. It was cold. It was a bit like Liverpool in the winter. Yeah. It was cold and damp, and there was a wind. You'd come out and you go, Jesus, the wind had cut you,
Cut through you. Do you know how difficult was it to get in, and how did you get on that trip in '86?
Oh no, it wasn't. I went to a place in Errol Park by the picture house in the Errol Park. Carlton.
Yeah, just
there was a little travel agent there. And you could go to any traveller. I just said, they had a book in tourist. You had a number of tours. They had to send me passport off. Then she sent a visa back and photographs and stuff like that. It was a bit of a bureaucracy, a few weeks. So, I was going in the April. I think I started the process around, before Christmas, the year before. And you had to send stuff off and then... they'd said, this was before the internet and whatever and phones. So I'd call in and say, has any come back yet? And she said, yeah, there's the stuff. And then there was a little process, but it wasn't difficult, just a bit of bureaucracy.
Do you know when you went back a second time in '89, you went with some university friends, didn't you? A few of you. Yeah. And you went to Leningrad and Moscow. Mm. And you went to 2 or 3 other places. Was there anything different about Leningrad and Moscow on the second visit?
Oh, it was remarkable in such a short time. All these businesses had sprung up. There was little kiosks everywhere. It was just total free enterprise, entrepreneurial. There was adverts everywhere. People stopping you on the street wanted to try and get money off you, sell you things. The whole thing was just totally different. Leningrad in particular was like pretty wild, There were just bars everywhere and people would just come up to you and, proposition you and to bring you home. And it was all that stuff, One lady was offered me some medals, great patriotic war stuff. She said, if you give me $30, you can have one. She had a certificate with them and everything. Whether they were kosher or not, but they looked there. Yeah. And she was a teacher. She spoke perfect English. That's another thing we realized. On the second time we went after it had all hit the fan. The amount of people who actually spoke English, who came up to us talking, right, the first time, only 5 years before, I never heard anyone speak English. No.
So this is 3 years after Gorbachev's doing his reforms to open up things.
A bit more, but no, it was...
89, from 86 to 89. Yeah. Gorbachev's attempting to do internal reforms, obviously still centralised, huge issues. Obviously, in 1991, things start to change a lot quicker.
I think the Soviet Union ceased to exist when we were there. It was December, because I remember they had the flag on the Kremlin, was still the hammer and sickle. And then I think when we went back to it, there was actually the Russian Federation flag. So, you'd have to look up them dates,
Yeah, it's an interesting time, certainly. In many ways, you'd often wonder what would have happened if those reforms would have been more successful, implemented by someone like Gorbachev and not someone like Mao in China. I mean, obviously, you're trying to modernise and reform at an unbelievable scale across huge countries, and it's not going to be easy. But when the reforms did come in, which were kind of pro-Western, free market reforms, they were disastrous for Russia, and that's almost precipitated all the problems in Russia now, but that's a different story. Now, you then went off-piste a little bit and you went to Volgograd and to Rostov-on-Don and
Novocherkassk.
So tell us about Volgograd, because it's the scene of the biggest battle in world history. And one of the things that I got from you early on in life, and my granddad, by the way, he was quite open-minded. He fought in Africa in the British Army for the Desert Rats. He used to talk about the Ericsson books, the road to Moscow, and then the road to Berlin. And he wrote about the huge battles on the Eastern Front, where 80% of the German army was occupied and died in World War II. And it was a huge, huge affair. And once the Soviets kind of got going, they suffered a lot of early defeats, staggering defeats, but they were pushed right back to Stalingrad, as it was called, and Stalin said, "I will not surrender that last few hundred yards,
not one step
because
back.
It's my name."
Yeah.
And really, he could have gone back and then drew the lines again and then reinvaded, but it became a totemic battle, which the Soviets eventually won. So what was your experiences of Volgograd, and what was the Mamayev Kurgan like, and do you want to tell us about that?
Well, that was phenomenal. Well, one of the things was interesting. Being there, one of the things we flew over on a Ilyushin 86 from Gatwick to Moscow. Whilst there, on the first time I went, the flights, one was the Tupolev 62, and I flew from Volgograd on a Yak 44 to Novocherkassk. I've always wanted to fly on a Yak. So it was great you going on these Soviet planes. I'm not really a plane buff, but that was a great thing about it. But Volgograd was amazing because, again, when we got there, we were the only people, foreigners there. We were in an in-tourist hotel, which was von Pallas's headquarters at Peace Square, right in front of the station in Stalingrad. And to think that this was the pivotal war of World War II and whatever, it was so low-key.
So von Paulus was the German general.
He was the German general,
He was in charge of the 6th Army.
That's right, yeah.
Basically occupied 90% of Stalingrad. Couldn't get that last 10% because of the guerrilla fighting, if you like, between in the rubble.
So that was what really it was, how it was just so low-key. And then this David guy, by this time we were mates, we'd settled in. It was about, I'd say about 6 o'clock, and he said, dinner'll be 7:30, and he said, do you want to go for a walk? I said, yeah. So he was very fit, although he had a big bag of pills with him. And we bolted along the promenade on the Volga. And of course, as we're going along, and we went to there's like what's it called, 360-degree panorama, and Pavlov's house and all that. Well, we saw all this ourselves.
Pavlov's the famous psychologist.
Yeah, well, it says that the thing about its house was one of the last rearguard actions. But the whole way it was, you just had that strip of land which was actually marked by a sort of inverse T-34 tanks they've got sort of embedded in the deck with these turrets sticking up in the air. And we just walked past it. We didn't realise the significance of them the first night. And it was quite warm. It was 20 degrees. So it was weird, really. It was southern Russia. You know, we'd come from the coals of Leningrad and you go down to southern Russia and it was warm. And it was, but then there was very few people about. The odd person that just kept walking past us. Must have looked at us to a pair of oddballs. But it was the low-key stuff. And then we'd never noticed Mamayev Kurgan because that's a little few miles further, north to them. We were coming from the south. But the next day to see Mamayev Kurgan is another thing about Russia. It was, at the time, I think, maybe it still is, the largest freestanding statue in the world or something.
So it's a statue of Mother Russia.
Yeah.
And it symbolises the Battle of Stalingrad, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, she's facing out. Mother Russia's facing out to the steps because from the height, you look across the Volga, right, and you're looking into Eastern Russia and all the Mongols and all the people, various races of Russia. She's got the sword and she's saying to them, come and fight for the motherland, you know what I mean? And you're like, hang on, I've never even heard of this. This is like, this just blows your mind. It's phenomenal, you know what I mean? It really is an amazing structure. And the whole thing is set up. It's a memorial garden, just quite big. And, you know, just the unknown soldier. It was all, again, so very, very Soviet, you know. And it was all about the Great Patriotic War. And the actual struggle then, when it's actually explained to you in this 360, do you have a word for it, diadem or something? It was, you know, an amazing sort of experience. It was quite thought-provoking, really, to walk around them places and think, and this is the way it was. But what really hit you and all was the fact that we were the only foreigners, 19 of us walking around, you know. It's
interesting as well when you think about it. You had the Russian Revolution in 1917. It's under a lot of existential threat from external invasions early on, etc. You've got the White Russians who were the counter-revolutionaries. You then have Stalin and, you know, the purges and the huge reforms, collectivization, the industrialization. But the Soviet military was in a bad way right at the start of World War II because of the purges, etc. But once the Soviet machine got going, the Germans were surrounding Leningrad, as you say, for 900 days. People are eating soap, rats, they're dying in the streets. Moscow nearly gets taken in 40. Yeah. 41. And then you've got the siege of Stalingrad, which later became Volgograd, sorry, the attack on there. So 90% of it's taken west of the river. There's a little bit left, and Stalin said, we don't withdraw from that. It's a symbolic thing. Back, yeah. So there's this terrible fighting amongst the rubble, close combat, unbelievable misery. The Russian winter sets in, the Soviets get going, the military machine kicks in, and then at the end of that battle, you've got 2 million dead. It's the biggest battle in world history. And then the Sixth Army, who were considered invincible, are captured. And then the war just turns, doesn't it? And the Soviets just march.
Well, it goes off to Kursk then. It's a battle right all the way to Berlin. That's why Ericsson's book, isn't it? The road to Berlin, you know. Yeah.
But it's staggering history. And what those people went through, 23 million dead in World War II. It just defies belief, because on the Eastern Front, when you had that intense fighting on the Eastern Front, you had the Holocaust, which was basically a byproduct of World War II and the chaos. And you had the racial war against the Eastern peoples and the Soviet peoples, which was ruthless. They just killed people, burnt the houses down. It was appalling. And at the same time, you had the Japanese thing with the Chinese going on. But this was racial war of annihilation.
Do you know, an interesting thing, especially in Volgograd, Stalingrad, was the people we spoke to in the museums and stuff, they never talked about Germans. They talked about Hitlerites. They would mention Nazis and Hitlerites. They never actually mentioned Germans. It was quite interesting the way they actually phrased that, you know. Yeah. It
really did capture the zeitgeist at the time, because there was a documentary I watched a few years ago about someone who lives on Eastern Russia, very remote areas, and they still commemorate the Great Patriotic War. For Russians today, the Great Patriotic War, it's almost like the big raison d'etre for being Russian.
It is.
That kind of, it underpins that Russian identity.
Another interjection is, one of the things, funny enough, we did see this, I think, everywhere we went. Moscow, in particular, the Kremlin walls, the hero cities, the unknown soldier. Leningrad, we saw it. And we also saw it, actually, in Volgograd. Was people getting married that day. They seem to get married every day of the week. And all the couples would come down with the flowers and their entourage. And, you know, they'd all be there. Sometimes it'd be like a small group tent with the bridegroom. Sometimes it'd be a big party, 40, 50, whatever. But the thing is, they'd all get down, obviously after the ceremony with the flowers and everything, and they'd always put the flowers on the graves of the unknown soldiers. And it was very solemn. Like, so that was another thing of this, you know, is it propaganda? Is it, but you see how deep it, well, they've all lost so many people. So what they're doing, as you say, they're getting married, two families joining together, but they're commemorating the families before them, and so many of them had most probably, you know, gone in that conflict. So that brings it home to you, that it is a thing for, you know, Soviet people, but Russian people, is that patriotic war is such a thing. It was like...
Yeah, it underpins everything, doesn't it?
Yeah.
One thing that still frustrates me is the use of the word Russia to describe the Soviet Union. I hear historians doing it.
Yeah.
I hear people on films doing it. Really, really winds me up that, you know, you're talking about two different things. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's just a slip of the tongue and lots of things.
Yeah.
But you see, they talk about like Russian. When you say the Russian thing, well, that's just like when I went to Leningrad the last time on a cruise. All it was Peace of the Grace and Pushkin, and everything was just. It's ultra Russian nationalist. And you're like, ooh, okay, yeah. But, you know, the Soviet, the first time being in Leningrad, how many years ago now? Was it, 30-odd, no, it's 40-odd years ago now. Yeah. I've forgotten. You know, the difference was stark. You know, that there was not that Russian, there must have been there undercurrent, but it's now overt, it's out. Everything is Peter the Great, Pushkin. I mean, they never said one thing about the Great Patriotic War, they didn't exist. The revolution didn't even take place. I was by the battleship Aurora, you know, which fired the first shot, whatever. And there's people hawking things, you know, about Peace of the Grace and stuff like that, so the Hermitage.
When you went back the third time to Leningrad, or as it was called, St. Petersburg, what year was that?
Well, I don't know, about 15 years ago, wasn't it? Yeah.
So by that time, the whole
it was-
Soviet thing, the unification of the Soviet Union was replaced by a Russian nationalism
just
based
totally,
on what
yeah.
might be called more kind of elitist concepts. I mean, that's not really the best way of describing it, but say Peter the Great and those kind of Russian traditions.
But there is they actually took us to Catherine's, what was it called? Catherine the Great's palace on top, yeah. Because there was a Scottish architect designed parts of it, whatever. And when they first were under the Soviets, it was actually shown as a sign of a elitist decadence, that this is the way these people lived, and, you know, the peasants and the way, you know what I mean? Right, on that cruise, the Tsar's palaces, there's 3 of them, actually. And also Tsarskoye Selo, you know, his village, stuff like that. And that was all, it was a bit like watching, you know, these historical dramas, these, you know, upstairs, downstairs, Downton Abbey, that kind of stuff. It was that kind of feel to what most of them people went there for. That the Great Patriotic War, the Revolution, it just hadn't taken place. It was quite phenomenal, really, to actually see. And, you know, just as you say, everything is entrepreneurial, everything's, you know, free spirit, everything. It's just totally different. It's unbelievable.
What did you notice about Rostov-on-Don and the other place that you went to?
Rostov, under the Soviets, a funny thing happened there. I don't know what it is. I said, what's this place like? I always thought Cossacks were a tribe, because the Royal Navy had a ship, HMS Cossack. It was actually involved in an incident in World War II with the Tirpitz or something. So I always thought tribal class, Cossack. I being stupid, like Cossack tribe.
So these are the horse riders who were traditionally
Well, that's the way,
UK.
yeah. So apparently Novocherkassk, right, and apparently this is like on the Don. You know,
is this technically in the Ukraine, Rostov? And
no, they're in Russia, but they're in the Don, in the Don. But that's the sort of the capital, if you like, of the Cossacks. So I thought, well, these are a tribe, but they're not actually. It's a bit like the Wild West. And they had their ethnographic museum and stuff like that. And I thought, oh, this is a lot of... Anyway, I went for a walk again. I just thought, no, sod that, I'm not into that. I walked out, and there was a big main road, a bit like Dunningsbridge Road, you know, but sort of houses on the side, but like not much traffic going on. It was quite dead, really. But a cathedral at the end, Orthodox. And I said, this is under the Soviets. I walked along to the cathedral, and outside there was a fellow with no legs, you know, begging. I didn't have any good kopecks or nothing. So I felt sorry about it. So I think I gave him a few quid. Went in, and everything was just burnt with all the candles and stuff, and it was quite impressive as Orthodox churches are. And then as I came out, I was walking back towards the bus, and there was a guy sort of with a limp sort of on the other side of the road, and he shouted across something to me in German, you know. And I looked, I said, what? And he said it again, but this time much louder, you know. And I went, nine. I said, nein sprachen zu Deutsch. And he went, yeah. He said, don't. I said, English. Oh, he said, you English? Yeah. I said, yeah. He said, something happened here. They won't tell you. I said, oh. He said, yeah. He said, yes. He said, they shot the people in 1962. I went, oh, okay. I said, well, okay, I'll look it up. He went, yeah. And then he was sort of fit. And then he disappeared into the bushes. And it was just by a park. Anyway, I went back on the bus, whatever. But you know what I found out later? You know who came from there? You know Lebedev, the fellow who died in the helicopter, who said when they were invading, I think it was the Chechnya, and he said to that Yeltsin's crowd, they said, oh, he said, go in with the tanks and kill all the Chechens and all that kind of thing, Grozny. He said, oh, yeah, okay. He said, but I'll tell you what, he said, I'll take your eldest son, your eldest grandson, your eldest son, and they all looked at him and said, you what? He said, yeah. He said, if they come with me, we'll go in and do the, you know, the onslaught into Grozny. Do you remember that story, no?
I've heard of it, yeah.
Anyway,
basically saying, put your own son.
He said, yeah, you go and do it. But a few weeks later, a helicopter crashed and Lebedev was in it. But Lebedev was from Rostov, apparently. But there was a strike, because there was a big, like...
Is this the one in the 60s?
Local factories and stuff, yeah. And apparently, they're all working. And it was a bit like, you know, the sort of working poor. And he said, hang on, you know, this is crap. We've got no supplies, got no bread or whatever. There was lots of problems. And so they had a big meeting, and people attended it. But apparently, not the locals, but the Moscow lads come down and opened fire and killed quite a few. You know, Lebedev was there as a lad. He was a young lad. he actually witnessed that fella, Lebedev. So that was interesting, you know what I mean? Yeah. But I was back on the bus and I was thinking, like, well, what was all that about, you know? It was just a regional town. It was quite dead in a way, you know. And I thought that was in Novocherkassk. Then we went back to Rostov, which was quite a big place. Yeah.
It's interesting because when you go there under the Soviet Union, there's a completely different narrative.
Totally.
And then you go back a few years later and it's all changed. Now, there's a great series that we've both seen by Adam Curtis about how Russian democracy kind of collapsed and ended.
Yeah.
Corruption became... there was corruption under the Soviet regime, but corruption became endemic. You had Yeltsin, who was a pro-Western drunkard. You had these I wouldn't say far right, but free market, neoliberal reforms have opened up the market that absolutely devastated.
People like him,
absolutely devastated life for the day-to-day Russian people. And that whole thing precipitated the rise of what you might call modern Putism, where you've got a guy in charge who's paranoid, who doesn't have anyone oppose him, bumps off his opponents, poisons people, kills people like Anna
Politkovskaya,
She wrote those great books critiquing him. Basically a mafia state and elite. You keep on side with Putin and everything's okay. But this all comes from those failed Russian reforms of the post-communist era that precipitated the rise of Putinism and this anger towards the rest of the world that Russia was disrespected, that the USSR should never have broke up. And there's quite a lot of nostalgia even. You hear Putin saying about the USSR should never have disintegrated, etc. It ties in with that the idea now of a Russo-centric nationalism that was reflected in the USSR. So even now the idea of the USSR has changed. There's a Russian thing now, isn't it? It's used as Russian propaganda. But those times were devastating after the capitalist reforms. It was all precipitated by Yeltsin's leadership, which was appalling, and the collapse of the Soviet regime. Now, have you been back a fourth time since then?
No, the last time I went was on that cruise, which was it was Mickey Mouse, really. It was like I didn't recognise anything. It was interesting, and I realised it was for a different market. You realise you're a dinosaur, and that it's not for you. You know, I mean, you know, you go to Versailles and places, and you say, and you look at it and you say it's an amazing build, amazing achievement, and that ever. But at what cost? You know, the Sun King. We all know the stories about there. But and that's the thing that they sell now, that the tourist people sell in Russia. That of course it's our hometown, and you know you get that feel. It's just a tourist thing, and they control totally the input. You know that they don't give you a visa. You can get a visa, but it costs you like about £100 odd, I think, to go free roving. But you're actually in the port, and they take them out on trips. And I said to a young guy, he was a Ukrainian, spoke Russian. He was on the boat. He accompanied us on one trip. And I said, would it be okay? I said, that 4 of us, Frank had been before with me. I said, if we slip away and go on the metro and stuff like that. And he said, well, actually, he said, I can't stop you, he said. But he said, your problem will be getting back in the port. I said, you're joking, it's just a boat. He said, no. He said, as you come off, he said, that the highway, because this place had been totally built up since I was last there, this port. I couldn't believe it. I'd been in a hotel on Visibility Island in 90, whatever. When I went, this place is totally built up. This whole estate, big posh flats. Oh, they said the posh flats. They look like just rabbit warrens to me. And there was this hotel in the port. Hotel was still there, but under a Western name. But he said there's a causeway, and there's like 4 sorts of roadblocks on the causeway. And he said it'll cause problems if you go back, because you shouldn't be, basically, you know, you haven't got a visa. And I said, well, that's £400 for us for the visa, you know what I mean? I thought, come on. And that's the kind of scenario now how they tied up. Yeah.
It's interesting as well. Like, I mean, I've been to Tunisia, and you travel around the world to places like Versailles and Paris, but if you go off the beaten track to what people are really living like, and it's hard to find like the the mean average citizen, isn't it? When you go to any country to find out what's really going on, and everyone sees the world differently, etc. But it's interesting when you go to places. I've watched places, documentaries where you go to the nice places and all that. And one of the things I like about Simon Reeve, and I know you've watched a lot of his documentaries, he's a travel journalist, etc., done loads of series on the BBC, is he goes to places and starts getting off the beaten track and talking to real people. And it's absolutely fascinating, isn't it, when you start to do that, to see what the real experience is.
Recently, I've found YouTube, and there's a lot of young, intrepid travellers on that. And there's one, it's a Russian girl called Julie. She's from some place out in Siberia. When I looked it up, it's a city with about 8 million people in. It's amazing. I've hardly heard of it. It's, in Siberia. She's got married to an English fella called Matt. He's from Brighton. They make videos, Matt and Julia. And even through 1923 and stuff, they travel extensively round. They travel all over. But because she's Russian, they do a lot in Russia and the Eastern Bloc and stuff like that. And it's brilliant. They do that. There's Bald and Bankrupt, another guy. He speaks Russian as well, because Matt and Julie speak Russian. And that's what you need, is that way in. And Bald actually does that. He goes to he goes to Kiev and he says, here we are in Kiev, there's the buildings that German prisoners built and all that, but that's all nonsense. We're going to take this train here, right to the terminus. He said, because there's a village there called, Petropavl, whatever. And he said, we're going to see what life is like there for the people. He talks to taxi drivers. He said, what's life like? And they say to him, shit, it's there, $35. He goes, what? He talks to all the little old women at the bus station, the babushkas. And he gives them a few bombs. He says, what's life? And they all say, it's crap, we come through all of this for this. It's actually interesting, that you can actually go on YouTube, and there are quite a few intrepid travellers and young people who actually speak their life. There's an Italian lad called David. He's from, I think, Venice originally. He speaks perfect Russian. He's excellent. He goes round on his own and he shows you, all the myths and talks to people and whatever. And, some of it's positive. Like, some of these places look great. Others, they show you the other side, the reality of it all. And, about the bureaucracy and the nationalism, and they don't talk about a certain place at the moment. They say there's something going down, you know what it is like, Ukraine. But it's interesting. Yeah.
I've seen you watching those documentaries, but they are valuable. And I've watched a tour of the US once by someone who I actually respect, and he just went to, the Liberty Bell and the White House, and you just think, God, you'd think the USA was this wonderful, wonderful place. And in many ways, that was the market they were going for. Let's go out to all the nice places. But I think Simon Reeve and those people who you've just spoken about, they're good because they do speak to, the average person and go, what's going on? What's your life like? What are your experiences? I think that's important, and I think that's what's often missing from a lot of the analysis of these kind of histories and modern travel programmes and also books. A lot of books you read, you don't really consider what the average people are experiencing and going through.
But the point is, though, is you say, look at North Korea and you think, hang on, how can Rocket Man control all these, And then thinking back when I first went to Moscow, on the metro, everything in Cyrillic, of course, that's their language, no colour coding. People were paranoid. You couldn't talk. I remember I said to a bus driver, the fella, Yevgeny, he drove us around a few places, and I just said, I learned enough Russian, Pashiva Bolshoy, Yevgeny. As I walked down the steps, I said, looked at him, and he just said, unshaven, scruffy, big overcoat on. It was April, freezing cold. And I went, oh, hang on, you know what I mean? So he is obviously a trusted guy within tourists, but he wouldn't talk to us or, There was one thing very positive. It was on Lenin's, the nearest Saturday to Lenin's birthday, because we had 3 Americans in this tour. Used to just take the piss, and we're going along this road. It was Leningrad. And there was all these people out. There was kids, middle-aged people, but quite a few little grannies and stuff. And they had these birch twigs, cleaning the highway up. Because, after the thaw, after the snow, everything's manky and stuff. And they were actually cleaning, the central reservations and the sidewalks and everything clean. And it was like sort of thankless task, you know. I thought, like, it wasn't nice, it was a difficult job. And then she pointed out that this is called Subotnik, that twice a year, in the spring, and then I think in the autumn, when Lenin died, wherever that was, they turn out the people, and it's like, I don't know how much coercion's involved, but they clean up the place, like blocks of flats, you know, all, you know, public areas. Of course, well, these 3 Americans, they just couldn't get this. They were like, oh, you know, what's the name of this road, Valentina? She, oh, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. They'd all just be pissing themselves laughing. They were just taking the mickey all the while. But the thing is, the Subotnik, and I went, I'd never heard of that. But that was actually all over Russia. That they come out and so, like schools, all the kids go and they clean up all around the school and stuff like that. And you think, hang on, is that a negative thing? Sure. Is it like, I don't know how much coercion went on. What I could see, just by, you know, okay, fleeting going past and looking at all these people, I could just see people, some of them talking and getting together. I didn't see anyone with guns or anything, you know, marshalling them. There must have been someone in control with a red band on their arm or something. But it's intriguing. I went, oh, hang on, Subotnik. I think it's Russian for Saturday or something. But Subotnik is, you know, that thing about cleaning the place up.
You've also been to China, haven't you, on a school trip? And did you stay in Beijing for that trip?
Yeah, maybe Beijing, yeah.
What was that like? I mean, were there any similarities? Obviously, this is post-Cold, end of the Cold War.
No, there was nothing Maoist. It was the time of the Good Friday Agreement.
Yeah.
I was there. I was in the hotel.
90s,
yeah, I was in the hotel when that came through. Easter. It was cold, but Beijing was again. There was no Mao stuff. There was 1 or 2 little old men. There was hardly any bikes. Everyone had big cars.
Chairman Mao, who was if you like, the founder of modern communist China. He's considered a big icon in China, but they weren't really emphasising that.
No, I went to his tomb and signed him in, but whilst I was there, the South African president arrived. They had a big flag and it was everything. But Beijing was like a carnival city. All the people used to come out every night. And it was welcome in spring, because, again, it's quite northern and cold, apparently, in the winter. But the weather was nice when we were there, April. And all these people had come out. I'm talking older people, middle-aged people. And all the ladies would have these, like, you know, silk-type pyjamas on and all that. And the men had all played these instruments. But, you know, the music was like Arabic. And it was the Gobi Desert. And it was like really driving along, you know, like, you know, the music was fantastic. And here they are all dancing in the streets. And you say to people, what's going on? They say, spring is coming. I'm like, what? I'm supposed to be in this totalitarian. I went, hey, wait a minute. Another thing is, gets outside the hotel one morning, it's always misty. Like misty, and trees with white lines painted on them, you know, and stuff like that. And there's a lot of traditional Chinese buildings around. You go, hang on, and then you hear this music like Victor Sylvester, and you go, that's funny. You go through the mist and the fog, you can hear Victor Sylvester. You go to the end of the road, and there's a flyover, you know, like the Walton one, what's it called? Queen's Drive flyover.
Yeah.
Imagine that, right? At 9 o'clock in the morning, on a cold and frosty morning, with mist, and there's about 200 couples underneath. The men with evening suits on, you know, dicky bows and stuff, and the women in big, all dancing to a record player, modern, you know, ballroom dancing. And I'm like, come on, what's this? Beijing? It was phenomenal. The culture shock in Beijing was just something else, vibrant. The people they talk to you. Oh, everyone come up to you and talk to you. Kids outside schools, you know. People in the hotels, everyone, they just want to, you know, serving drinks, stuff like that. People, they just want to talk to you, and you're like, hang on. Yeah. They're phenomenal, and they all speak English, like most of them. And it was phenomenal. It really was. It was cheerful. It was bright. It was lively, just full of life. It was a fantastic, a different impression that people had of, you know, what they say communist China. But by that time, the economic thing had changed.
Yeah, it became it's effectively a capitalist.
Oh yeah, it's
market,
isn't
it? Yeah, with a communist government, as it were. And I think what the Chinese government struggles with is usually in capitalist markets if you've got two parties, even though they may be very similar, you can at least kind of go back and forth.
Yeah.
And I think China's struggled to keep that kind of one-party control.
Well, that's the thing. Yeah.
Which is always like a little bit of a difficult thing to manage. I mean, since then, you've got the current Chinese government far more centralised, resisting, I wouldn't so much freedom movements, but attempts at autonomy. It's much more centralised now than, say, it was in the late 90s. And, you know, it's an interesting time in Chinese history where you've got... I always forget how to say the current guy's name. Is it Jinping?
Jinping, yeah.
Jinping. Because the last one was called Xiao Peng, wasn't it?
So, the fellow who brought in the reforms,
yeah. It's quite a different place than it was in the late 90s.
But I think as long as you keep giving the punters, more and more bits of plastic, like, I think they keep them up. But I mean, again, I don't think for 1 minute that Beijing reflects China.
Yeah.
You know, I actually worked with a guy who went to teach math in China, and he was in some, like, Kuomintang or something. I said, "Where's that, John?" And he said, "It's not far from the Mongolian border anyway." There's another one like the girl who lives in a Siberian city, 8 million people. Anyway, when I looked up where John was teaching, there's only like about 9 million people lived there. I've never even heard of the place. But he said a thing. He was teaching maths. I said, "What level?" And he said, there was 2 levels. He said, but basically, he said, GCSE type stuff. He said, don't forget, it's foreign language for some of these people. And he said he was doing the maths at this first level, and then he was going to go on and teach higher maths. But he said you should go there if you're a teacher. He said, it's good for your ego. He said, because the first lesson he gave, by the way, in English, you know, he's talking of teaching in a foreign language. And he said, when he finished, he said, they all clapped him. And he fell over. And he said, but that's what they do. They respect, you know, and you think, hang on, what's going on here? In a way, it's like Russia with education and teachers and stuff like that. You know, in Russia, they all respect teachers and teaching, and you know, it's held in this high esteem, even now with all the reform. But it's quite intriguing, that.
Well, I've got a friend who teaches in China, and, like, said similar things. He said, like, he was there during lockdown as well. Yeah. He was in that city, what's it called? Wuhan?
He was
actually in Wuhan during the COVID thing, where, like, they literally stayed in apartments. They weren't allowed to go out. But he said, like, the teaching there, the respect you've got, and a completely different way of doing things.
Well, I think just as you say, it's that the cultural thing, the respect education. It's quite weird, really, isn't it? You know, you look at it and think, well, okay. And that's the interesting thing. That's what you want to look at when you go to these cities. You want to see through it and say, well, but and interestingly about China, though, they don't stop people from travelling, do they? You know, you go to London and you go to these places, and all you see is the young Chinese people, and you go, hang on, like. So there's that aspect of it. Well, because, of course, you can't, you know, keep the... Well, that's the trouble with the Russians, wasn't it? The Soviets, they fell for the same trick. The Soviets was that idea where only the elites, only the, you know, certain people, the political appointees could travel. And so, therefore, you know, you got that disadvantage. You say, well, no wonder, you know, no one speaks your language.
People resented it. Last thing... That was my little joke about when Stalin used to do a speech. The first person who stopped clapping ended up in trouble. But we've had some really good discussions, haven't we, about the history of the Soviet Union and some of the extremes where it got it wrong. We've both read Solzhenitsyn, The Gulag Archipelago. We've both recently read is it Shermatov, Kolima, about the gulags, etc. What's your overriding impression of Soviet history and Stalin?
Well, Soviet history is as you say, the Soviets, if you look at it, it didn't last that long, did it? From 17 to 89. And I think you get the last impression when it went back to St. Petersburg was they say that Russians like this big man thing, you know, they need a leader and all that. Well, I don't know, disingenuous that is. I mean, to say it's like, again, stereotypical, isn't it? But it does make you think that Russian history, looking back to them SARS and whatever, and, you know, the landowners and, you know, the whole thing about serfdom and whatever, pretty grim. And the thing about the stranglehold of the Orthodox Church and stuff, it was always, I mean, the Church and state were always the one with the, you know, with the SARS and, well, Tsarina, that she made sure the first thing, both Catherine did it and Alexander. They get there, they learn the role, but at first thing they take on board their orthodoxy. That's a given. And it's that thing about the total control. It's the absolutism is just. And I suppose it's too inherent that, like, I always remember Gorbachev when he was in Leningrad, and a woman stopped him. They were walking along. He had this lovely overcoat on and walking along with us, what she had. And anyway, a few women stopped him, and she said, the way they call them, like Mikhail Sergeyevich, whatever. And he went, yeah, like, and she said, this is crap. Apparently, he said, what's that? And he said, saved up or she'd been waiting 2 years for a fridge, 2.5 years. Soviet fridge. When she gets the fridge, it lasts about a week and it breaks. It's crap, And she said, of course, she can't get it back. So what does she do? Spends all this money. Does she go, back in the queue? It's just, like consumer goods, it was crap. And his entourage went, no, tried to push it out the way. And he said, no, leave her. And he said, no, come here. And this was a part of the reforms. And he was saying to them, it just doesn't work. We have to reform this system, right? There was good aspects of it, the support for underlying nations, you know what I mean? The emerging thing, Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, supporting these people, supporting struggle, but also like Patrice Lumumba University, all that stuff, yeah, great. But, as he said, they were losing out on the basics. They were falling behind. But I don't, it does make you think. And the Soviets, I mean, if you look at the whole history from 17 to all it was struggle.
Well,
yeah, one disaster to another.
If you look at John Rawls, always uses his veil of ignorance argument and says, like, what's it like for the average person in a country at any one time? Yeah. If you look at Russian history, I mean,
it's awful.
Grim. A lot of it's to do with the climate. A lot of it's to do with the size of the nation and trying to organise it nationally. Then you've got the ideas of communism coming in. But I think Gorbachev, one of the problems in politics is that people like Gorbachev, they very quickly get gobbled up by more Machiavellian.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the things people often say is, all politicians are the same. The second you get a politician who comes out and starts being honest and truthful, they very quickly get destroyed by people who are more ruthless.
Yeah.
And I think that's an unfortunate aspect of human nature.
Well, it was a funny thing with Reagan and Thatcher. Like, Thatcher was besotted with him, actually. And Reagan, I think, actually, but I think it was the people behind him said, hey, hang on,
Yeah.
And the thing, I think he was done more from here than domestically, right? Although they made sure he wasn't popular domestically, because they would make sure, And this is so, the thing is, as he said about the domestic stuff and production and stuff like that, and he wanted to liberate it gently, let's ease it off and let's, and he could have done that. They could have come in from the cold. Yeah. This didn't have to be, Yeah. And I can understand it in a way. People like Putin and stuff like saying, sod that, you don't trust them. Because that's what they feared on. Because, if you actually look at the behaviour of the West towards, that Zadar and them people, when they opened up that reforms, it was off a cliff. It was off a cliff.
I think the other thing as well is, like, there was a big opportunity at the end of the Second World War where Truman, again, because of the Hawks behind him.
That's right, yeah.
And I think Reagan was like really, this is part of the record, etc. But Reagan was really surprised when he realised that the Soviets didn't want nuclear war and didn't want to take over the United States. He actually had to be convinced by them.
Yeah.
Because he'd heard that much stuff through the Cold War that he went... It's like someone like Khrushchev, even Stalin after World War II said, give me Poland, you can have Greece.
Yeah, that's right.
He let all the communists get killed in Greece. Right, yeah. Thinking, okay, I understand power. You kill all the communists in Greece and give me Poland.
We'll have them there. We'll kill all the people there.
As well as that, during the rise of Hitler, there was a lot more suspicion towards Stalin and Hitler, and I think Stalin was a bit frustrated with that. But, I mean, Stalin was a power player. Yeah, he was paranoid. Yeah, he was ruthless. Yeah, millions died in those camps, the spirit of paranoia, etc. But the West might have engaged more at key times in its history, which isn't to say you sanction or agree with things, but there was a genuine belief in social justice. And Henry Wallace said this, who was a potential presidential candidate. The Democrats ultimately went for Truman as the safe pair of hands, but there was a lot of opportunities within the Cold War to maybe learn from each other.
There was a guy called Georgy Abartov. He was, I think, foreign minister. I'm not sure it was after Mikoyan. Baldy guy, sort of elderly, but quite astute. And he was some kind of think tank, and he spent a lot of time in US, spoke, English. And he was interviewed one time, and he said, and he went to Harvard, one of these places, to give a spiel one weekend. And it was all about, the Reykjavik Agreement and stuff like that, arms
limitations
and stuff, SALT something. He was talking, and he said these were the creme de la creme of so-called Americans, or the so-called creme de la creme of American society. And he was in Harvard, and he was talking about things, and this, that, and the other. And then when he finished the spiel, this guy said to him, Mr. Abartov, he said, the way you're talking there, he said, is about our relationship with the US, USSR, as if like we were old friends and stuff like that. And Abartov said, yeah. And he went, yeah, well, And Abartov said, we were allies in World War II. And this guy went, he stopped him in his tracks. And Abartov said, we were allies in World War II. And this guy went, and he looked around like, come on, help me out, lads. And he went, so he said, that's what I'm talking about. He said about cooperation, that when we had a common enemy, and what it was, the creme de la creme, they didn't know that the Soviets and the USA and were allies in World War II. Such as talk about paranoia and brainwashing. And Georgy Abartov, he went, like, what's this? And that was an interesting point.
It's interesting in the recent Oppenheimer film as well, where they explore how Oppenheimer was accused of being a communist, the guy who founded the nuclear bomb, or was part of the project came up with it. But that's quite interesting, looking at that paranoia that led into McCarthyism, etc. But, there's issues of scale here, and there's issues of understanding of history. Like, you look at the Vietnam War, millions and millions of people are killed in the Vietnam War, etc. But a good, honest appraisal of the Cold War, and a good, honest appraisal of communism and its faults, etc., is one thing, but also there was lessons to be learned from that and things that we could have done. A lot of it, of course, is based on this kind of, I wouldn't say revisionist history, but you look at like Poland and places like that now, and Hungary, where, we want democracy and freedom, and now they're turning back towards autocracy and dictatorship.
Usually cultural stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, it's cultural stuff, but also you've got aspects of the United States, like the Republican Party, now parroting that line as well. But history moves on. Listen, I know you want to get back in the garden. It's a beautiful day, and that's 1 hour. But thanks for that, because I wanted to get down your experiences of the Soviet Union for posterity, because it is something. I mean, they say about like no one's alive now is in World War One. Soon it will be World War Two, and at some point in the future it will be the Cold War. And I think that it is great to see people like Simon Reeve on the BBC going to places, scratching the surface,
it's good. He does go behind the surface, sure.
And looking at things at a deep level. And I think that the history of the Soviet Union, China, places like that, we do have these narratives. And I'm a big critic of Russia today, Putin. Big critic of China. I wouldn't want to live in either of those places.
No.
And if you said to me, would you have liked to have lived in the Soviet Union? It's a big no. But again, you need to appraise history fully, and that's part of what we're doing. Listen, thanks very much for your time. I'll let you get back to your garden tools. It's a beautiful day here in Liverpool. Thanks for listening, everyone. I hope you got something from that. Something a little bit different as well, about something that you might have heard something about, but haven't heard in that kind of depth. So thanks very much for listening, and thanks again, Dad.
Okay, no problem.